Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. If you've been paying attention to the news recently, you may have noticed that many of the big stories revolve around questions of race. Increasingly in this country, race is the headline. Just this week, Roseanne Barr was fired and her show was canceled on ABC after she tweeted an attack on Valerie Jarrett that many described as racist. Starbucks, the coffee retailer, closed more than 8,000 of its retail stores in order to re-educate its white employees about their unconscious racism. Meanwhile, a bar in Portland, Oregon hosted a reparations happy hour where non-white patrons drank for free. Over in cable newsland, MSNBC aired an hour-long primetime special that not only attacked racism, but also engaged in it by stereotyping an entire group of people based on their skin color. Here's a selection from that.
The gentrifiers of today, their parents or their grandparents, ran away from the city to get away from black and brown folk. And now their children and their grandchildren are saying, oh, the suburbs, there's only so many Olive Gardens I can go to, so I need to go back to the city and get my life in the city. But when I do that, I need to have my hot yoga studio and my pottery studio and my stuff represented. And if you intrude on that, I will then call the police.
Well, more and more it feels like racial division is the subtext of virtually everything in this country. Even topics that seem unrelated to ethnicity suddenly are racially fraught. The effect of all that is a deeply angry and divided nation, but also, you may have noticed, a terrified one. Many Americans are scared to say what they really think about just about anything. One false word and you could be denounced on Twitter and lose your livelihood. It happens. We see it all the time. Best just to smile and nod and hope the witch hunt passes. How long do we have to live this way? And how did we get here in the first place? Joining us now is someone who has paid attention closely for a long time, Peter Kirsanow, a lawyer who serves on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and has written a new thriller called Second Strike, which I can tell you firsthand is excellent. Peter, thanks a lot for joining us.
Always my pleasure, Tucker.
So there's something strange going on. Even as the country becomes much more diverse, and that was a trend that we were promised would make the country more harmonious, the country seems much more on edge about questions of race. What is going on?
Well, I think several things are going on, but the overriding thing is a political narrative that's driven to enhance one argument or the side of one particular side. And it has its genesis in two things. First is the political imperative of getting Democrats elected, chiefly.
Yes.
And so we have a lot of this division on the basis of race because there are no policy prescriptions anymore. If you've listened very closely, you don't hear any workable policy prescriptions, or very few workable policy prescriptions, but what you hear a lot of is identity politics. I've been on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights in 17 years, and in that 17 years, we haven't had more lucid conversations about race or identity. They have gotten increasingly sophomoric, they've gotten increasingly opaque, and they're driven by an ahistorical narrative, one that doesn't have, or very little bearing on what truly happened in the United States of America. Look, the fact of the matter is that in my lifetime, matters of race and racial discriminations have gotten demonstrably better in ways that we could never even imagine. If you look at the interaction between individuals of various races today, they've never been better. Individuals of races. But when you come to the interaction between groups, it's become hostile and toxic, and it's a function of trying to get certain groups to have an allegiance to a certain movement or certain party for a political imperative.
May I stop you there and just get back up for a second to address something that you said that I'd never thought of? The conversation is increasingly general and less specific. So whereas 30 years ago, people might say, in order to close the achievement gap in standardized testing, we need to put more money into Head Start, for example. Now the conversation is, this group is bad, it has always been bad, it will never get better. Why are we hearing fewer solutions than we used to hear?
Well, I think for a couple of reasons. One, again, is that political imperative, because solutions augur against having a political advantage. But I think it's also because there's a tendency on the part of some to shout down others, to cast others as the other, and again, that's for a political imperative, but you're
Right.
afraid to say things that are demonstrably true. To give you one example, a couple of weeks ago we had a hearing at the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, all-day hearing, people from the Justice Department, Police Chiefs Association, you name it. Everybody in the world was there and the usual groups were there. It was a hearing on hate crimes because of the ostensible spike in hate crimes since Trump has been elected. But facts are stubborn things, and when you take a look at the data, and when I ask questions of this, after everyone made these grand pronouncements about how horrible and horrific the spike in hate crimes is, we had no hard evidence of such spike, and the best data on this comes from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which has shown for the last 30 years there has been a decline in hate crimes. There's been a decline in all manner of discrimination for more than 30 years. Yet we have greater sensitivity, heightened sensitivity, and you have to ask yourself this, why this is the case. And I think to some extent it's because it helps the agenda of certain groups, of certain parties, of certain individuals.
So you keep hearing that we need to have an honest conversation on race, and I'm always for conversations, particularly for honest ones. But I wonder, after all these conversations, if the country is becoming more divided, maybe that's not evidence that it's not working. Do we need to talk less about race or more about race? Does the conversation idea hold up to scrutiny?
Two things. One is, Tucker, I disagree that we're having conversations. We always hear that we need to have a conversation, but what we get is harangues, and the harangues usually come from one side,
right.
And most decent people kind of duck their heads and watch out for incoming fire. They don't want to get caught in the crossfire, and you know, if you go to colleges, law schools, almost any institution of higher learning, and frankly, K through 12, there are only certain acceptable opinions that you can have. There are students who are punished, and they know this, and they know precisely how to react in the context of a classroom debate ostensibly on race. There's only one acceptable opinion, and you're not allowed to offer other opinions, and that doesn't forward the conversation. And one other point.
No, and it doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help anybody. I can see why they try to shout you down, by the way, but I'm glad that you came. Thanks very much. Peter Christnow, great to see you.
Thanks, Tucker.
As we just told you, Starbucks closed its retail stores this week in order to re-educate its employees about racism. The assumption, of course, is that Starbucks' white employees are racist simply because they're white. But isn't that a racist assumption itself? Why is Starbucks wading into this topic anyway? Isn't it supposed to be a coffee shop? Professor Jason Nichols has been following the story since the beginning, and he joins us now. Professor, thanks for coming on. So I thought Peter Christnow said something really interesting a second ago, which is that we talk less about solutions and more in general terms. So just to give you one example, if the people who run Starbucks are upset about the racial climate in the country, and it's fair to be upset about that, then why do they have so few stores in black neighborhoods? I think the biggest concentration of black New Yorkers is Bed-Stuy in Brooklyn. I think there's one Starbucks there. You go to the Upper East Side, Starbucks in every corner. So if they really want to make things different, why aren't they opening Starbucks in black neighborhoods? Wouldn't that do a lot more than these conversations they're having?
Well, I think if you want to talk about that, I would say more, even better than that would be employing more African American and Latino baristas and managers. I think that's probably a better solution rather than just placing them in their neighborhoods. Because in many cases, that might actually lead to displacing some mom and pop shops and coffee shops that are independently owned, particularly ones by African Americans and Latinos and Asian Americans. So I would agree with you there that there are also other substantive things that they can do, but I think that this is absolutely a beginning, and of course this was just supposed to start a dialogue, not supposed to solve all of the world's problems in 4 hours.
But it's clearly an example of something that I've noticed a lot of recently, which is collective blame. The idea that because you look a certain way, you're responsible for a certain set of historical sins, you must have a certain set of attitudes, which is, of course, a racist assumption by definition. And so I wonder if you're going to approach this question, why not do it with the true assumption that racism is a human problem? Bias, hatred, evil, they're human problems committed by all people, not unique to one group. But that's not what Starbucks is doing at all, right?
Well, I think one of the things is that that's not Starbucks' experience. Starbucks had the arrest of those two gentlemen and other experiences of bias, and it seems like it's pretty one-sided. So they wanted to address that, and I don't think that what they wanted to do was...
So wait a second. First of all...
No, hold on, Tucker. Let me just finish this one point. I think one of the things that they wanted to do was to create a dialogue between people of different backgrounds. It wasn't about blame, and I think that's one of the things that's missing oftentimes when we have these discussions, Tucker, is that people think that just because you want to have a dialogue about race, and yes, history matters and all these things, you know, I think we need to think of it that way, that we're just going to have an open exchange of ideas and have an open dialogue.
I'm sorry, that's false. What our kids are being taught and what Starbucks is teaching us is that certain groups are more prone to racism than others, and that's a lie, as you know, because all people are fundamentally the same in that they're capable of great good and great bad, and racism is one of the great bads. But they're all capable of that. There's no group has a monopoly on racism in this or any other country, and to suggest otherwise is itself racist, right?
Tucker, here's the thing. Here's what I would say is that I do think that groups have their biases, absolutely, but the difference is some groups have the power to enforce those biases and make things more difficult for others and discriminate against other people.
Well, people don't always act as groups. I mean, hold on. That assumption itself, I mean, maybe I'm the liberal here, but I mean, groups don't act according to like directives, like all white people, all black people, all American Indians don't get some message from HQ. Individuals act as individuals, like a lot, mostly. And people are capable, all people, regardless of color, of racism. But that's not the message that Starbucks is teaching, which, again, is itself racist.
So, Tucker, when have two white men been arrested in a Starbucks for being white? If you can tell me that.
I don't know for being white. I mean, I don't know what that means.
So
I mean, okay. Look, the point is that, yes, you've had a lot of anti-black racism, but that doesn't mean that everyone who's white shares a special burden of racism, because that assumption is itself racist. So to get beyond this morass, you need to acknowledge that human sin is universal and that people aren't responsible for the actions of people who happen to look like them. Because that's collective punishment and collective guilt, and it's wrong, right?
Again, Tucker, I think you have inferred more from this than I think Starbucks is actually saying.
Oh, no, I haven't. No, come on, Professor. Let's not be disingenuous. I'm not inferring anything. I'm listening carefully to what I'm being told.
Okay, but there's anti-black racism, and when we're addressing that, sometimes that can come from anybody of any background. So what we're trying to do is address some of the issues of anti-blackness, immigrant sentiment. We're trying to address that, but we're trying to address that for all people. There are times, believe it or not, when African Americans discriminate against other African Americans based on the assumptions that they have. So I think, addressing bias and trying to be anti-bias, we're not trying to say that this is just white people or,
Well, no, of course you are. That's exactly what you're saying, and you know it. And
that is not
that's exactly what you're saying. That's exactly what Starbucks is saying. It's exactly what my kids' teachers are telling them every day. Let's be honest. I guess we can't. Professor, great to see you. Thank you.
Absolutely. Always great, Tucker. Thanks.
How safe is air travel? It's not a question you'd think you'd have to ask yourself, but government documents obtained exclusively by this show suggest that the FAA has dramatically lowered its standards in hiring for air traffic controllers, dramatically, in shocking ways that shocked us, and we do this for a living. We've got details ahead. Prosecutors in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington interviewed former FBI Director Jim Comey during an investigation into his former deputy, Andy McCabe. McCabe, you'll remember, is accused of lying about giving sensitive information to the media, leaking, a number of times. Meanwhile, the price tag on the Mueller investigation keeps rising. It is up to $17 million in taxpayer funds. Feel safer? Jonathan Turley is a lawyer and a professor of constitutional law at George Washington University Law School in Washington. He joins us tonight. Professor, thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Tucker.
So, the Andrew McCabe question, from our perspective, again, not knowing all the facts, but it seems cut and dry. We know very well that it is a felony to lie to a federal agent, and that's one of the reasons that, that Martha Stewart went to prison or General Flynn pled guilty. So we have read accounts that he lied to investigators at the FBI. Why wouldn't he be charged?
Well, I think that the expectation is that he will be charged. The problem facing McCabe is the record that his own colleagues created. It was career officials at the Inspector General's office and the Office of Professional Responsibility that concluded that he had lied. One of the key witnesses was James Comey himself. In fact, McCabe's lawyers sort of went after Comey for his recollection. So one of these individuals is not telling the truth or recounting the facts correctly. It's going to be hard for them to walk this line, to pursue people like Flynn and say that they're going to give a pass to someone like McCabe. You know, the $17 million is a really huge amount, but the greater cost to the public is that we paid all this money and we don't find out the truth, that we're not going to get what we paid for. And so I think the test is going to be, both in the FBI investigation and the Mueller investigation, is will we be able to see the facts? Because the prohibitive cost in all of this would be lingering doubts. And McCabe's a good example of that. If McCabe is not indicted, then they need to explain to us why. And there might be valid reasons why. But we need to know where the distinction is.
Because I'm starting to sense a standard here in which government officials get to lie. James Clapper, for example, clearly lied, committed perjury before the Congress when he said there was no spying by the NSA. He's still on cable television yapping up a storm. He's on Twitter. He's now selling a book. Prominent interior designer Martha Stewart, posing no threat to anyone, goes to federal prison. So, I mean, am I imagining this, or is there a double standard and a troubling one?
Well, that's long been the problem in Washington. We sort of have this animal farm where everyone's equal, but some people are more equal than others. And it goes long back before the Obama administration. It is very hard to get justice officials or high-ranking officials indicted or held accountable. They often get very light treatment. Clapper's an example of that. And when Clapper was confronted with the fact that he had given false testimony, he said, well, that was the least untruthful thing I could have said. Well, most people call that lie. I mean, most people say, well, that's still untruthful, right? You were in front of Congress. No, a normal person wouldn't have that least untruthful option when they're trying to answer a question.
Yeah, I'm going to try that with the IRS next time they ask me why I haven't paid in full. It's
I'll leave
unbelievable.
my business card.
Just kidding, by the way, to the IRS, I pay in full. Professor, thank you for that. Thanks for that perspective. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Tucker.
Former Secret Service agent and NYPD officer Dan Bongino has followed this investigation from the very beginning, all the tangents of it, and he joins us now. So, Dan, a question that has arisen in the last 48 hours with, I think, some urgency is, when did the spying on the Trump campaign begin and under what pretext? What do we know right now about that?
Well, Tucker, here's what we know. We know the timeline and the origin story of how this started has changed multiple times. We were initially told it was the activities of Carter Page that started it. Then when the Carter Page saga fell apart, then they shifted quickly to the George Papadopoulos meeting with Alexander Downer in May. And now that that's changing again, they're trying to go back to a 2015 story about British intelligence passing information over here. I lay that out for you, Tucker, to make one simple point to you. The FBI is hiding what I call paragraph 1. When I was a federal agent and I had, say, a credit card fraud case, when you write a report, Tucker, what did paragraph 1 say? Bank fraud investigator so-and-so called you on this day about a stolen credit card number, and then the rest of the case follows from there. The FBI will not and refuses to tell people what paragraph 1 is, and I think it's for a very specific reason.
What do you think the reason is?
I was waiting for you to ask me that, Tucker, but I want to keep talking. So here's what I think the reason is. We're focusing on the pull. Okay, we're focusing on the information that was pulled out of the Trump campaign. The spy we're not supposed to name, call him an informant, I don't care. I'm not getting in the euphemisms game, all right?
It's the same thing.
We're focusing on how... It's the same thing. It's nonsense, okay? And I'm glad you've been hammering people on this because it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
But we've been focusing on how he's been interacting with the Trump sphere, trying to pull information out. The real question here, and the next shoe to drop, and the one we've been on while I've been researching this case, is how was the email information about the Russian dirt pushed into the Trump sphere, Tucker? It was fed to Papadopoulos by a Maltese professor way back in March, months before this formal investigation. Now, let me just drop a boulder on you here. That professor has now disappeared. He was interviewed by the FBI in February. Now, if this is a Russian collusion case, and this guy's the Rosetta Stone and has the keys to the kingdom and knew about this Russian dirt and fed it to a Trump low-level guy like Papadopoulos, then how come the FBI let him disappear after interviewing him in February?
So, I mean, that's kind of the key to the whole story. So this, I mean, that's the genesis story of this investigation,
Yes.
of the Mueller investigation, of all this Russia stuff, which has gummed up the gears of government since day one of this administration. All goes back to the Maltese professor. I hate to say that because
Yes.
it sounds nutty, but it's true. And we don't know where he is. Why don't we know where he is? And do you think it's possible that this was a setup from day one?
I don't think it's possible anymore, Tucker. If I was a betting man, I would bet my right thumb on it that this was an entrapment operation. Now, who specifically set it up and why is still an open question. It would be irresponsible for me to say, but there's a lot of evidence leading to some very, very suspicious characters. But you just asked, and you posed to your audience the critical question. Stop for a second focusing on the poll. Who pushed the information into the Trump sphere that was going to be pulled out later as evidence they were colluding with the Russians? The answer is we know the guy. So if he was interviewed by the FBI, let's just get to the bottom of it. Yet, Tucker, the guy is nowhere to be found. He's in the Ren and Stimpy land of the left socks. Nobody knows, but the FBI interviewed him in February. Amazing how that happens.
The whole thing is unbelievable. And the more you know, I almost hesitate to learn more because I want to sleep at night. Dan Bongino, thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Yes, sir. You got it.
Joy Reid is apologizing for blog posts that until recently, she said, were written by hackers surreptitiously. What about the FBI investigation into this? Where'd that go? All of that's next. All week, we've been telling you about the Joy Reid you never knew. The rigidly progressive, race-hustling MSNBC anchor once had very different views, and they've been revealed by newly discovered excerpts from her long-defunct blog. For example, Reid once complained that immigrants were taking American jobs. Imagine that. She described Lou Dobbs, our friend Lou Dobbs, as her ideological twin on immigration. She told Democrats to spend less time attacking white people, amazingly. She also compared John McCain to the Virginia tech shooter, and she spread 9/11 conspiracy theories. Well, in April, she commented on some of those blog posts. Watch.
I've spent a lot of time trying to make sense of these posts. I hired cybersecurity experts to see if somebody had manipulated my words or my former blog. And the reality is they have not been able to prove it. But here's what I know. I genuinely do not believe I wrote those hateful things.
Well, we assumed that Reid would once again continue to blame these new set of opinions on a mysterious fake hacker, because, as you just saw, she's done it before. But no, this time she admitted the truth and said she's sorry. So good for her. It's better not to lie so much. But there's at least one outstanding question here, a question that hangs in the air. Whatever happened to that FBI investigation that Joy Reid and NBC News ordered up when they were still pretending that the blog posts weren't real and were committed by maybe Vladimir Putin? Is that FBI investigation still ongoing? And what's the penalty for using federal law enforcement to perpetuate a hoax? And how much did it cost? And is NBC News going to pay back American taxpayers? Joining us now is a man who's considered these questions, Larry O'Connor, associate editor of the Washington Times. So, Larry, this is a real question. And by the way, again, I just want to say, good for Joy Reid for telling the truth. It's always good to tell the truth.
Little late.
But they did order up this FBI investigation, and NBC stood behind it.
Yep.
Are you allowed to do that in perpetuation of a hoax, which is what they did?
Last I checked, not so much. And I actually checked with a couple of former Department of Justice officials, and they said, no, that's actually kind of a federal crime, making a knowing false report to the FBI. And no one knows how much of our government resources have been spent on investigating a hoax. Now that the FBI isn't spending so much time investigating political opponents of Barack Obama, one thinks that they actually would like to chase down some serious crimes and not just Joy Reid's fantasies, to cover her own butt, by the way. And let's be clear here. Her lies, and which were reinforced by her network, NBC, they were all to just cover her up. It was to make her look good. It was just to protect her job. And apparently she didn't have to, because NBC is going to stand by her no matter what.
Yeah, and by the way, I'm all for networks standing by their anchors, I should just say. Well, and I also think that most people are decent and forgiving. And I think that if you say, I'm sorry I said that, or my views have changed, I think most people think that's okay. I certainly think it's okay. What's not okay is to waste our time and the resources of federal law enforcement perpetuating a lie. Now, no one who does that, and there are a lot of people who do that, by the way, a lot of fake hate crimes, for example, they're never prosecuted. And she won't be prosecuted. But shouldn't NBC have to repay that money? Why do they get a pass on this?
I would think so. And I think also, listen, I understand, and I'm all for radio networks forgiving their and not firing their employees, too. While we're at it, let's have that on the record. But I do think NBC has to answer for a couple of things here, because they were part of this, Tucker. They circulated this report from Joy Reid's expert, the cybersecurity expert, that said that she had been hacked. That damages their brand, because they're in the business of fact-checking everybody they disagree with. Well, it's time for them to actually come clean a little bit and say, yeah, this was all bogus. It was wrong. There needs to be some transparency there. And yes, you're right. At the very least, whatever this ended up costing the federal government, NBC, Comcast, Universal, they should repay that money.
Well, they're liars. We know they're liars. They leaked the Access Hollywood tape to the Washington Post. We know that. Everyone who works at NBC knows that, and they did it for political reasons, and they've never admitted that.
Right.
So
they were going to do a
thorough
investigation into that, though, Tucker. I remember they made a lot of noise about that thorough investigation.
Still trying to find the real killer, Larry.
That's right.
Larry, thanks for coming on Friday night. Good to see you.
Thanks, Tucker. You too.
Well, the Boy Scouts of America are no more. They're now Scouts BSA. Mike Rowe is an Eagle Scout, and he joins us next to discuss the changes and what they mean for us. Stay tuned. After more than a century of teaching millions of American boys marksmanship and woodcraft, patriotism, good citizenship, the Boy Scouts of America have decided to change completely, starting with their name. It is now the Scouts. It's gender neutral. Mike Rowe was an Eagle Scout. He went on to host Dirty Jobs and Someone's Got to Do It. He now hosts Facebook's #1 show. It's called Returning the Favor. We spoke to him recently. Mike Rowe, thanks a lot for joining us. You were famously an Eagle Scout as a boy. The Scouts are no longer the Boy Scouts, but simply the Scouts. What's your response to that?
Well, it's funny you should ask, Tucker, because no less than 10,000 people have asked me that very question over the last month on my Facebook page. Distinguished Eagle Scout, if you're keeping score. 5 or 6 years ago, I was awarded that, and it was very touching. And look, I'm watching what's happening carefully. I've sent 50 to 55,000 letters out over the last 10 years to other Eagle Scouts. And I think the country needs the Scouts. I think the country needs the Future Farmers of America and Skills USA and 4-H desperately, now more than ever. So it does concern me to see all the confusion swirling around the organization. But like so many wounds, I'm afraid many of these are self-inflicted. And I also think that some of the confusion that's going on is legitimate. I read their official statement. While girls are being welcomed in, I didn't read anything about integrated camping trips or troop meetings. I think it really is a play to compete more directly with the Girl Scouts. And I understand why the Girl Scouts are upset, but since when is competition a bad thing? Right. So I think, character development and leadership development have never been more important than they are today. So my hope is that the Boy Scouts assume the opportunity that's presenting itself and become an antidote for the safe space environment that's out there, and push back a little bit. I mean, not to sound like the angry guy on your neighbor's porch yelling at the kids on the lawn, but when I was in the Scouts in 74 and 75, it wasn't a safe space there in the basement of our church. I mean, you'd go home with a bloody nose sometimes or a black eye. We had a boxing ring. It was a vibrant place where you really could test yourself and fail in a way that on the one hand made you safe enough to attempt, but on the other hand didn't try and check every box and please every single person. It's a tough time. I'm sympathetic for the leaders, but I'm afraid you've got to draw the line somewhere and be very, very clear about what you stand for as well as against.
So you don't see this as the end of something then?
I don't know. You know, I mean, again, you either evolve or you die. But at the same time, I think people are confused because the scouts simply haven't come out and said categorically what they're for, right? So I just think this conversation touches on every single hot point right now going on in popular culture, from tolerance to acceptance, which, by the way, I'm not sure what the difference between those two things is anymore, but there used to be a big difference. People are struggling for their own identity. And look, the last time I was on, we talked about this. We talked about the idea that everything is either being informed by a safe space culture, or everything is being informed by people who want to be challenged. I think people are desperate to be challenged, and my hope for these youth-based organizations that help preach character is that they look for people who want to be challenged, and not curry favor so much with those who want a nice reassuring pat on the head.
Yeah, that's how the Episcopal Church died.
Yeah,
I know. Mike, wow. Yeah, well, I watched it happen. Great to see you. Thank you for that. That was really smart.
Be prepared anytime.
Well, we all know that diversity is our strength. Is it also the key to being a good air traffic controller? The FAA thinks so and has changed the entrance requirements accordingly. You should know that. We have the details next.